So we're going to be talking about value, and the person that's going to talk with me about this is Hamish Mackenzie, and Hamish is an expert in, I guess, what I would say is sort of helping organisations uncover and communicate and monetize the value that they create, their valuable difference, I think is what he would say. So I've known Hamish for quite a few years. I know for the last 20 years or so, he's worked with businesses from startups right to large ones right across, particularly across Europe, but also outside of that in the US and Japan. You'll hear from him. He's born in England, so you won't be struggling with the accent. But he's been in Germany since I think 2002. He went there. He followed his heart. He went there for love, and he's been there ever since. But I do know that his German is fluent, and he's now a dual national, which is probably quite helpful given the situation. And he tells me, it's a little secret, that he tells me he owns a pair of lederhosen, which I've never seen him wear. But he insists that he does on special occasions. But I've known Hamish because he and I both sort of share this passionate belief around peer learning. And one of the things I always encourage people on these calls and people I speak to is it's incredibly valuable. And some of you will have done this with me, to join sort of peer learning groups and to expand your horizons both within your industry and outside. And so some of you will have joined my chief exec sessions or the business brain trust or my learning groups or whatever it is. Hamish does similar things. So you'll see him when he speaks, he's got the McKay chief exec forums banner behind him, which is, I think one of the global recognized brands, isn't it, in chief executive learning groups. But we do them ourselves. So Hamish and I are both members, very active members of the Society for Advancement of Consulting, which is a global organisation which is aimed really at raising the standards of practice and ethics and learning within consultants. So Hamish is the ambassador of the SAC for Europe, and I'm the sort of co-founder of the global nonprofit group of experts in that sort of space. And he and I have been in the same sort of mastermind learning group with consultants from across Europe and North America for the last 3-4 years. And we meet regularly, it's probably once a month, and we have lots of conversations about key issues that are emerging in the marketplace. And it always feels like when we get to one of the end of those conversations, that actually the value of those conversations would be really useful for other people, which is why at the end of one a couple of months ago, I asked Hamish whether he'd be willing to have a live conversation, actually, and invite some of the people from my community to kind of listen and chip in and ask questions. And I was delighted he said yes. So Hamish, welcome, and thanks for joining us from Munich this evening.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martyn. Thanks for inviting me, especially having this discussion in particular is really important, because I think it's weirdly, it's one of the things that often gets overlooked in the kind of chaos of daily business, right? So, and organizations often don't take the time to take a step back and really understand what their value is, whether they're communicating it well, and whether their value has perhaps changed over time, because it's not a static thing that we're talking about, right?
Well, when I suggested having a chat, I asked you what topic, and you said value-led growth. I mean, what is it that makes that so important right now, do you think?
Well, I think probably the first thing to do before I go on to that is to just define what I'm talking about when I'm talking about value, because value can mean different things to different people in different contexts, right? So what I'm talking about is value as it's defined by customers, specifically relating to the outcome that they're looking for whenever they buy a particular product or service. So maybe it's, before I go on to answer your question, I'll just give you a very quick example of that. So I was talking to the sales director of a company which basically operates testing labs, not for COVID, I don't think, but various other diseases, whatever. So I was chatting away to him, and I asked him, as I ask pretty much everybody, gets annoying occasionally, I think, because I ask a question so much. But I said, so what's your USP? What's the value that you really deliver that your customers really, really care about above over and above everything else. And he said, speed. It's all about speed. We can turn around lab results pretty much faster than anybody else in the world, we think. And that's really what it's all about. If there's an urgent need to get the results quickly, then that's when people call us. And so I said, all right, can you just talk a bit more about that? And while he was, I'm hearing myself, sorry, let's turn this down a minute. It's me. So while he was talking about it, I asked him to, I didn't ask him, I started having a dig around on the website and having a look and seeing what they're talking about on the website. I did that for a couple of minutes, and then I interrupted him and I said, Andrew, listen, you said it was all about speed. And he said, yeah. Well, I've just had a quick look on your website, and speed is nowhere to be seen. You're talking about the quality of your equipment. You're talking about the talent of your scientists, how they're the best scientists in the world. It's all about you. You're not talking about speed at all. And he looked at me as if, I just told him that one of his best friends had died or something. And he said, okay, I think we better have a meeting. What's your calendar look like? And the conversation went on from there. But it sounds obvious. It sounds almost embarrassing to talk about it. But I see it all the time. People are not focusing on the value that they actually deliver and what their customers care about.
And I suppose my expectation will be that right now.
So, yeah, just in terms of, sorry, did you say something, Martyn?
Yes, I did. Sorry, I don't know if you heard me.
Sorry, yeah.
I was just sort of saying that right now, I'm guessing that that's really quite important. Is that, these days, it's noticeable how much more research customers do before they actually get started in on the purchasing journey. So that kind of communication probably is far more important now than it's ever been. Presumably, is that your experience?
Yeah, no, definitely. I completely agree. I mean, and we'll talk about this later. I don't want to turn this into a claim like a marketing tactics conversation, because it's much, much bigger than that. But certainly in the markets I deal with, which tend to be quite complex business to business technology products and services, if there are 10 decent players in whatever it is that they're looking for, by the time they actually get round to talking to a salesperson, they've already discounted 7 of them, because there's enough information out there for them to do their own research. So there's a very big chance that you've already been discounted before they're halfway to a decision before they even start talking to you, right? So that's one thing. Secondly, and this may sound harsh, but one of the results of this pandemic is that a lot of the weaker players in many markets are going to die. So if you're left at you're still standing, then average is really not going to be good enough anymore, even less so than it was before, particularly bearing in mind the first point about the power of customers. And so I think really the key to growth going forward is to be very, very clear about what that value is that you're delivering and what your customer actually cares about, and to really maximize that potential, both within your organization and in terms of how you communicate it externally.
And you spoke to me, we had this conversation not that long ago, actually, and you gave me the sort of 3 principles that you talk about in that space. Are you happy to share those more widely?
I might have actually added one since then.
Go on then, you forward.
So because all of these things are a movable feast, just as valid for my value that I offer as it is for anybody else's. But yeah, the first 3 that we talked about, I think, was firstly, as I just mentioned, kind of uncovering what that value is, because what you think it is may be quite different to what your customer thinks it is, what they actually care most about. That quite often happens. The second thing is getting everyone within the organization very clear about that and talking about it and communicating it in a consistent way. And the third thing is making sure that all your external communications and everything that you do is all about that value, and that you really live it within the organization, right? And the fourth one that I wanted to perhaps add on to that is the fact that, and I think we might talk about this a bit more later, it's a process, right? It's not an event. You don't decide what your value is and then that's it for the next 10 years. It's going to evolve because customers' needs and tastes are going to evolve. So yeah, those are the kind of 3 or 4 things that are really key, I think.
And one of the things that I'm often asked about is that first step. How do you understand what customers really value? Because when you speak to them, quite often they'll ask, what's the most important thing? And they'll say price. And it isn't. And it isn't because, when they phone up and they speak, they'll ask about loads of stuff before they ask about price. Or you'll get the sense, you'll speak to them about what's important and they'll just tell you about what they expect from what they get now. So how do you get past that? How do you understand what's really, really valuable to your customers?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, firstly and most obviously, it's about having regular customer contact and enough channels in both directions to make sure that you know what's going on in the market, what's going on about in the minds of your customers and prospects. That's partly the kind of the old thing about developing marketing personas and that kind of stuff, but it's more about having your finger on the pulse all the time, so that you know what's changing as it's changing. At the same time, though, that's not enough on its own because customers don't always know what they need. The old quote about I think Henry Ford. If you asked customers what they wanted before the car arrived, they would have said faster horses. So sometimes you're going to come up with something which just totally changes their perspective and totally changes the game. Second thing is having a very deep knowledge of your competitors and how you shape up next to them, what's different about you or what could be different about what you offer and how you offer it in the future. And the last thing, which I often encourage people to do, is to shop their own business and to really take some, I think it was Jack Welch has called it staring out of the window time that he used to take every week, and really think about, put yourselves in the shoes of your customer and think about what might be valuable. And one of the things we'll also maybe talk about later is the fact that it doesn't have to mean investing millions in R&D. It doesn't have to be something earth-shattering. It can be very, very simple service type things, which can actually make a big difference when it comes to delivering that value and also getting your customers to talk about the value that you're delivering. And I think we're going to talk about that a bit later as well.
They sound like good topics to come back to. When I've spoken about this in these groups before as well, I've used the kind of 3Ds, and that you've been talking particularly about one of them. So I've talked about distinctiveness as one, because you need to stand out, you need to be the better choice, the obviously better choice. And you need kind of, the rational case that goes with that. And one of the tools that I've used for quite a long time is that kind of strategic positioning grid, where you have, these are the buyer decision factors down the side, and this is how you stack up. Are you behind the pack? Are you in the pack? Are you ahead of the pack? Are you disruptive? To really understand where you're positioning. And that's incredibly powerful for getting people to think about that distinctiveness. And then you've got the second D of dependability. And when you get past that sort of early adopter stage of the market and you start to decide, you want to go into the later adopters, that whole sort of 70% of the market that comes on board later, that dependability is a huge driver for them. But on top of that, nobody ever got sacked for buying IBM. That's what is the modern equivalent of that? But then on top of that, you've got the third D, which is desirability, which is a much more sort of emotional construct. And that's the bit where I see a lot of the time people struggling to, the emotional connection, the prestige, things like trust and values and even personal identity. The reason you choose a car is not necessarily to get to A to B, it's because you think it says something about you. So you've talked about distinctiveness quite a bit there. How do you, in your practice, how do you tap into that more emotional side of the customer?
Well, It's obviously easier in some markets and some products than others. I mean, you talked about cars a minute ago. One of the examples I like to use is Ferrari. You know, if you think about what going back to marketers, what they normally talk about is what I talk about is features, benefits, and outcomes, right? And a feature of a Ferrari would be the V12 engine, for example, which sounds like nothing else. I at least I always know when there's one coming, because it sounds totally different to anything else. The benefit you could argue is that it will get you from A to B a lot faster than anything else on the road. But nobody ever bought a Ferrari for either of those two reasons. What they buy a Ferrari for is the outcome, and the outcome is that when they get in that car, they feel like a race driver, and that is the emotional component to that sales argument, right? That's what they want. Maybe you can add on top of that, you know, they feel like they're part of the elite, whatever. But that's really, you know, as a car nut, as you can probably tell, that's the feeling you get when you get in the car. Now, how do you manage that if you're dealing with something a bit less exciting than a Ferrari? Well, the example that I like to use is a company, Big Ass Fans. So Big Ass in American, you know, ASS fans. They make industrial ceiling fans for warehouses. Now, they can't find much of a less sexy topic than that, I think you'll agree. But purely because of their name, you're automatically smiling as soon as you hear about them and you go and check them out. And if that's all it was, if it was just a funky name and everything else fell down, then you know, and there wasn't a good product and the service didn't match it, then it wouldn't mean anything. But if you actually go and see them and talk to them and see how they present themselves, then you just know that they're a company you want to do business with if you're in the market for a industrial ceiling fan. So there are lots of different ways that you can do it, depending on depending on the product. Sometimes you might need to rely on branding, a word I can't stand, but other times it's about what's going on in the customer's head when they experience your product.
It's a personality side of things. So we were, like you said, you know, we'll try and steer away, because I know that we've got people on the call from just about, you know, every sort of industry, from business to non-profits. But yeah, that whole kind of the personality and the values of your brand and what it is that you stand for is huge potential in that space to differentiate yourself. You mentioned something earlier. You said, you know, we'll come back to this, and I'm wondering whether now's the time. You talked about getting your customers marketing for you. It was a sort of throwaway line that you said at the end of one of your previous answers. What do you mean by that? And is that related to this emotional side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. I mean, everyone always talks about, and you know, we started off talking about, we are talking mostly about delivering value to customers. What I also like to talk about is getting more value from customers by getting them to spread the word about, you know, how fantastic you are, assuming you are fantastic. And this is one of the most powerful things that you can do from a sales and marketing perspective. And your friend and mine, Alan Weiss, has been trying to sell a book called for a while called Fire Your Salesforce, because he believes, and I agree with him, that you know, the old modes of selling are increasingly going to become irrelevant because of the reasons that we were talking about at the beginning, that customers have so much power and so much information that actually, and this is already true in many consumer markets, but it's going to become increasingly true in business to business markets as well, that one of the most powerful sales and marketing tools you have are your existing customers, and leveraging them, and you know, finding ways to do that, you know, not in a in an abusive way, but in a way which they're happy to do. I can give you one theoretical example, if you like.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So this is, and I keep meaning to do this, but because we've been in lockdown for a year, I didn't get around to it when I first decided I wanted to do this. But anyway, so I have a client. My main client is in Düsseldorf, has been for the last year or 2 years, and I always stay in the same hotel every time. And every time I go to that hotel, I always order a glass of the same wine, always, every time. I've been there 30 times and had been there like 30 times in the 12 months preceding COVID. And so let's think about value in terms of the wine. And obviously a glass of wine in a hotel is not the main reason you're going there, but it's an element of the value that they're delivering, right? So in terms of levels of value, level 0 would be, I check in, I go to the bar, I get a glass of wine from a pretty disinterested, unfriendly server, and take the glass over to a seat or back to my room, whatever. That's level 0. Level 1 is that I go there and have this very friendly person who asks me how I am, and where I've been, and how's my day been, and gives me all the chat while I'm ordering the glass of wine, and I go away a bit happier and say, oh, yeah, it's nice. So level 2 would be I walk in, and as I'm checking in, the woman says to me, I realized that you're ordering the same glass of wine every time you come. Would you like us to send one up to your room for you? Oh, yeah, actually, that would be great. So I'm thinking, yeah, now I'm really quite impressed with the level of service I'm getting. The next level after that would be, I check in, I go up to my room, and there's a glass of that wine standing there already, and a message to say, hello, Mr. Mackenzie, here's your usual glass of wine. Thank you for staying with us again. And then the level after that might be on my 5th visit or my 10th visit, whatever the economic, the economics of the offer might be, that I walk into my room and there's a whole bottle there, right? So this is a very simple, silly example, but the point is, once I get to that free bottle after the 5th visit stage, I'm going to be telling everybody what they're doing in that hotel. And if I'm going to be telling everybody I know, if I know they're going to Düsseldorf, you've got to stay there. And it's very simple. It's not expensive to do, but it could be incredibly powerful in terms of recruiting me as an evangelist for their brand.
And that's the stuff that you were talking about it can be little simple things. I think I've written about this in my book as well. I know you talked about this as well. There's a couple of aspects of it, and one is creating the experience, and the second is creating the platform. And in the sort of business to business, how does that translate into business to business? And I've often said, do you want to be the person at the conference behind a table with a stand talking to people, or do you want to be the person on the stage who's doing the case study with your ideal buyer's biggest competitor? That's where you want to be. You want to be seen with your customers, particularly the sort of high profile ones with whom you've done great things, who are supportive, if not evangelical, about you. The best business comes from the conversations that people have when you're not in the room, doesn't it? It's what is your brand these days? Your brand these days is what people say about you when you're not there. And that's what you want to get. But there are opportunities you can create, there are platforms you can create if you're doing the things that you're describing around those seeds of engagement, those fantastic experience upon which evangelism is built. I'm glad I asked you to come back to that. You talked a little bit earlier. You talked about 3 things, and I'm just going to sort of nudge us on one notch, because in fact you talked about 4, didn't you? Because you threw an extra one in, but you talked about kind of understanding the customer value, and then you went on and you said getting everybody internally aligned on the value you deliver. I kind of have my own views on this, but I'm going to throw it to you. How often, in your experience, is that a big issue, and why?
It's very often, surprisingly often, it's an issue. And the larger the organization, the more complex the organization, the more geographically dispersed the organization is, which is obviously even more of an issue now that everybody's working from home and hasn't seen each other for a year in many cases. Then it becomes even more common. Having said that, I mean, sometimes there are legitimate differences, right? You can't always communicate the same value or the same message if you're an international organization in every country. I mean, for example, in technology, I do a lot of work in technology, and in Germany, if you're trying to sell technology, the Germans want to know all about the minute details. They want to know everything. They want absolutely, the A to Z of how it works and why it's better. If you want to sell the same technology in the States, you better have a sexy story first, and the details we'll worry about later when we're installing it. But now we want to hear how amazing that is, what amazing things it's going to do for us. I mean, this should always be a part of the message you're communicating, but the weight of that message needs to change dramatically between Germany and America. And that's one of those mistakes that many companies make if they're trying to move either from there to Europe or from Europe back in the other direction. They just think, oh, we'll translate all the marketing, fine, no problem, that will work. But it doesn't. But getting back to the main point, just daily business gets in the way, and the more complex an organization is, it's like Chinese whispers. So somebody says one thing, and then by the time it's gone through a few different hands, it will come out slightly different. And so the way to uncover this, and this is what I always suggest chief execs or senior leaders do, is that if they're a bit concerned about this, maybe there's been a bit of underperformance and I'm not quite sure why, because nothing's really changed, go and pick 10 people, most of whom should be customer facing, but also a couple who aren't, and ask them to explain what the main value is you deliver to customers. What do they really care about? And quite often you'll get a lot of very different answers. If you get a lot of very similar answers, great. But quite often they'll come back pretty different. And in the worst cases, they'll come back conflicting. And that's when you've got a real problem, because if people are saying completely different things to the external audiences that you're interested in, then that's a huge problem.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I like that test. The test that I often use, and I see a few people here, some familiar faces who will have heard me talk to them about this and see me do it in their organizations, is when you talk to your sales team about why they didn't get that sale or whatever, if the answer comes back around price, this is probably your issue. The issue is probably because your sales team don't have a very clear perception of your value, and therefore they're not able to communicate it. And I think certainly, so that's in the kind of business context. But one of the things that in a non-profit context as well, when we have these conversations, you go through and really start to identify your value and talk internally about it, there's almost like a light bulb goes on, and an infectious enthusiasm that starts to click in, because people aren't used to really appreciating the huge value that they have and the huge value that they provide. And it unlocks an awful lot of really good thinking, but it also unlocks an awful lot of straightforward income as well. And so I was going to ask you, on the back of that, in your experience, you've done the test, you found out, we're lacking this sort of cohesion around our value internally. We're not excited about it because we don't really understand it and we're not on the same page about it. So if that's the case, how do you go about bringing people together and getting that real laser sharp clarity on your value?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's slightly different in different cases depending on the organization. It's like I'm a bit of a poker player as well, and whenever you ask an expert, what should I have done in this particular situation with these cards, they always answer, well, it depends. That's always the answer. So, but in terms of the kind of the top level approach, I guess for me, it starts at the top. So what I usually do is try and get the leadership team together, 6 to 8 people maximum, ideally, and to really sit them down and get them clear on what it is and get them to agree on what it is, so that we have a message to start off with. We need also as I was talking about before, very clear routes of feedback, both internally and from externally to internally, about what the value is, whether we're actually delivering it, whether the customers are asking for anything new, whether competitors are offering anything new that we're not. So all that feedback needs to come into the mix. And then it's very much about a big focus on internal communications. So and often this is one of the things that gets neglected in organizations, because the communications focus is always on outside. There's not that much going on inside. I mean, I can tell you maybe I can come on to some horror stories later about internal communication failures. But and the last thing is as I was saying before as well, it's about it being a process and not an event. So it's going to be a dynamic thing. It's going to be a fluid thing. And so once you've sat down and you've decided what the message is, you're gonna need to review it on a regular basis, right? And I think last time we spoke, you were talking about some examples from where you used to work in Boots, right?
Yeah. This is way back when we had real jobs, or I had a real job. I think somebody, it may have been the same person that told me this, but he was talking about exactly what how do you embed a perception or a values, whatever it is, but in this case, the sense of what your organizational value is. How do you embed that across? And he was saying that, I might have 5 meetings a day, 5 days a week. That's 25 meetings a week, 40 weeks of the year. That's 1,000, 2,000 meetings I have. And each one of those is an opportunity for me to tell a little story and then just embed 1 or 2 of the same things. And he said, leadership is boring, but this is what it is. And I think it was Richard Baker, who used to be a senior exec in Asda, and he'd come up with the sort of Alan Leighton crew. There was a time in sort of late 90s, early 2000s where a lot of the senior team that went on to pervade retail came out of that sort of that Asda environment, and he was one of them. And he joined Boots as the new chief executive, and I've been there for a few years, so I'd seen a few come and go. But he started this thing of whole company meetings, whereby we had Boots is fabulous, well-equipped organization. So in their head office, they've got sort of layers of people and balconies. But he would stand there and he'd talk to 5,000 people in the building at the time, and it would be live streamed to the stores and the logistics and this sort of thing. And on one of his first ones, he showed up with this sign that he brought from the Boots Museum. This is Boots, he's got his own museum, bought from the Boots Museum, and it said something like quality, value, and service. That was the 1920s or 1870s or whatever it was sign. And I think, clearly he'd not suddenly gone in there, as the story said, and saw this and had a revelation. He knew what he was looking for. And he found this thing, and he came back and I said, this is the root of Boots. This is where Boots started. This is where we come from, and this is what we need to be. And then a few weeks later, he started to bring these stories out that exemplified different aspects of this. And exactly as you say, in the small pieces, he told this story. There's a couple of people on who are ex-Boots and may remember this. He told this story. He said in one of his early months, he was doing a visit around stores with his stores director at the time, a chap called Alex Gawley, who's I think now president of Walgreen Boots Alliance globally. But he was in the store with Alex, and they were looking at the merchandising and the new materials and products that have come out. And he's halfway through asking Alex some questions, and Alex just put his hand up and said, "Sorry, Richard, you're just going to have to excuse me a minute." And he whistled off and he sat down on the till and he logged himself in and he worked the till for 10 minutes to try and clear this big backlog of queue that had been building up during the lunchtime. And when he finished clearing the queue, he went back to Richard, his new boss, and said, "Sorry, just had to do that. Carry on, what were you saying?" And Richard would tell this story, and I must have heard it 5 or 6 times. And it was part of that kind of myth building to really sort of exemplify that this is the value that we provide. This is about the service. And here's the example that I want you to learn from. And I'm going to turn it into a story. Whether that story ever happened, I doubt very much. But he would tell that over and over again. And he had half a dozen of these that he would just trot out to try and really drive that message through the organization. So I think, that kind of understanding the value that customers really, really want, and then finding ways to just continually embed that through. I'm with you all the way on that. But you asked, you said then after that, and I know we don't want to get into tactics, but you said in your third point, and then refocusing all of your external positioning on that value. So mindful that it is going to be different for everybody here. What are the big sort of themes that we should be thinking about in that, projecting that externally?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, this is just one element of, of this whole story. But what I'm going to do is, if I can manage to work this out technically, is I'm just going to share, and believe me, I'm the last person in the world who's going to kill anyone with PowerPoint, but I'm just going to show literally one slide. So this is my kind of standard positioning sweet spot slide, and I see my job as a consultant to make things as simple as possible. I bring simplicity, not complexity, right? So this is what I've tried to do with this. So we've got 3 circles here: simple, credible, essential. If your message of your positioning, if what's going on in your customer's head is simple and credible but not essential, then you're kind of like a nice to have, right? If it's simple and essential but not credible, then you're basically, all you're delivering is an empty promise. And if it's credible and essential to them but not simple, then you're basically killing yourself with complexity. And what you want to do from a positioning perspective, and which does obviously heavily influence the marketing that you're going to do, you want to be right in the middle, and that's where your perfect position is. The classic example of this is, and I hate to use Apple as an example, but because everybody does it, but they're just so good. And so their original positioning for the iPod was 1,000 songs in your pocket. So they weren't mentioning the product at all. They weren't talking about the design. They weren't talking about anything really to do with the product. All they were talking about was the outcome for the customer. And the outcome for the customer was, I suddenly have 1,000 songs in my pocket. And for somebody like you, I'm sure as well, you grew up with Sony Walkmans and tapes, and then portable CD players, and suddenly to have 1,000 songs in your pocket, it's like, holy cow. And of course, they weren't the first to do it, but because they had that promise and then backed it up with a beautiful product which worked really well and was dead easy to use, that's why they killed everybody else. So you've got to deliver as well. It's not just about the positioning, right? So
it is, yeah, you're right. It sort of comes back to the dependability, but you're also right in the sense that, that the reason that's such a fantastic line is because it hits that distinctiveness in terms of functionality, but this is quite an emotional punch as well. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Wow. It's a very cool positioning. Now I've just prompted my lovely colleagues here to say, kind of help me out. What questions have you got? What haven't we answered? Either stick them in the chat or raise your, I think Zoom has a little hand that you can raise if you want to. It's under reactions, I believe. So if you've got questions as we go, please do feed them in. But one of the things that, while I'm waiting for all this fabulous flurry of fantastic questions that I'm sure will come, one of the things that you mentioned there, and you mentioned it a couple of times before, you talked about outcomes, and you've talked about value as well. Are those the same? I mean, how do you differentiate between those two terms?
Well, I would say that the outcome is an element of value, and it depends on the product, on the market, exactly what what the different components of value are going to be. In some markets, price will be there. In some markets, price is totally irrelevant. And if you've done your positioning right, then price will become, even if you're, relatively speaking, doing a commodity product or service, then you can still make price a lot less relevant. So outcome is the focus on outcome is a part of the value that you deliver, and it's more about the result, the result that the customer is going to get at the end.
So what it provides for them is one step in the process, isn't it? It's what that then enables them to have, to achieve, to become.
It's the ultimate, it's the ultimate result of whatever it is that they're doing. Again, I can give you a real example of a client of mine, if you like.
Yeah, please do.
So this is a technology customer whose technology happened a year ago to be extremely suitable for people working from home, but also for schools and universities who sent all their kids home and needed to kind of refocus their positioning around this remote this new remote reality, and so the outcome element of that, I mean, the value is partly that the devices that they sell are relatively affordable compared to something like an iPad, for example. They don't have an operating system running on them. They're essentially like a second display for your computer. So there's no kind of new software to learn or installation problems or anything like that. So, and they're small enough to fit on anybody's desk, because a lot of kids have very small bedrooms, very small desks, so they can't put an enormous machine on their desktop or whatever. So all this is great, and all this is part of the value, but it's not really the point. The point was that you're basically enabling, in Germany's case especially, you're enabling education to go digital. You're enabling the learning experience for the kid to be extraordinary and a step beyond what it would be if you're just standing if the teacher is standing in a classroom and writing on the board. It's a much different experience if you've got a screen in front of you and they can react to what you're doing during the lesson. You can do this in the classroom, but you can also do it remotely. And it's all about the kids' experience on the one hand, and the ease of use for the teacher on the other hand. So they don't have to learn any new technology. They're just having an extra screen which they can use to then do sketches just like they would on the classroom board. It's much easier than it would be with a mouse. Make notes from the kids as they're talking back to the teacher during the lesson. So it just makes the whole thing much more interactive and more collaborative, and transforms the learning experience. So their positioning needed to change from being all about the device to all about the learning experience. The result of all that is that they were basically sold out within about 6 months.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Richard, I saw your hand go up there. Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Martyn. I thought I'd try and help break the logjam. But one of the things you said earlier on, and I'm really interested in this issue, which is about constant reinforcing. Hamish talked about the sort of it's a process, not an event, and I agree with all that. And I just wonder whether I got hold of the wrong end of the stick of value, because you said the Boots story, that actually you didn't know whether he was telling the truth or not. And I wondered how you square that with authentic leadership, because that's quite an important issue, especially in the not-for-profit area. I know it is in the commercial world as well. So, I mean, if I had a CEO and I found out he was telling me stories which weren't real, I'd be pretty pissed off. So I just wondered how you square the two and whether I've got the wrong end of the stick about value.
No, I don't think you've got the wrong end of the stick. I think I was being flippant. When I look at it with the distance of time, and with the cynical now I spend most of my time working behind the curtain. So you're kind of thinking, how do we construct a narrative that enables this sort of change? And generally, you're absolutely right. You're not going to construct a narrative which is based on fiction, but you're going to try and choose parts of the present experience in order to help really reinforce that narrative. So whether that event has happened exactly as the way that Richard described it, I couldn't tell you. I'm sure that there's something there, because why would he leave himself open to that situation? But I think the point is that there is a narrative that he wants to create, which is, this is what good service looks like. Good service looks like serving the customer before you do anything else, because that is your number one priority. So how can I turn that into a story that people will remember? So that was what I meant, and the fact that, I'm there sort of 15 years later going, did that really happen? That's probably just me being cynical. But the point is that 15 years later, I remember it. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Absolutely. Maybe he was Welsh, you just embellished the story, Martyn. Don't worry. I'm a Welshman, I can say that.
Maybe he was. I don't know, Hamish, would you have a different perspective on that?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I would also, and I think this idea of authentic leadership is also, potentially very powerful. I would also add that there's a downside to that as well. Sometimes, especially in leadership, is that you can't, if you wake up in an awful mood, or something's happened terrible, and you go in being authentic, then that's not a very good idea in terms of reflecting your mood to your team. So that then in that instance, it's more important to be professional, I would imagine. But no, apart from that, I would totally agree. I just want to ask, I'm not sure how many other questions we've got, Martyn, but I've got one to you quickly.
We've got a
Because
couple, but you go ahead.
okay, just very quickly, because this is your area of specialism and it's interesting to me because I know a lot less about it. So I'm very much talking about all this in a business context, but I know that you do a lot of work in non-profit. So what, how does this translate to non-profit? What do you think, or what's your experience in terms of value for a non-profit?
That's a really good question. It's not a direct. It translates incredibly well, but it's a sort of adapt. You need to adapt it slightly, and the reason is because within some non-profits environments, you've got a kind of very social enterprise model. So you are selling to a customer, and that all makes perfect sense. It translates entirely into that space, particularly with the emotional side, because you usually got very mission-led, very sort of values-led organizations. But you've got other spaces in the non-profit where you've got a multi-sided business model, effectively. So you're delivering to this group of people, and you're being paid by this group of people. Or you've got a more complex environment, something like House of St. Barnabas, where your members are one audience, you're the cohort of people exiting homelessness and getting trained through the club is a second cohort. The charities that are referring those in because they're ready to go on that journey is another cohort. And the people who are going to employ them after they've spent 10, 15 weeks of apprenticeship in your club. That's it. So you've got 4 different audiences, one of which is paying, but all 4 of them are bringing something to the mix. And in terms of understanding the value proposition there, each of those audiences has a different value outcome. And it's all really important to understand all of that, even if it's just a commissioned service with people that you're delivering it to understand the value that the commissioner needs to get from that at a deeper level than it's simply because they're legally obligated to. That it translates. So the whole philosophy translates. There's a degree to which it needs disaggregated. But it was a very good question. I'm going to skim back. Hopefully that's answered it.
Yeah, it has. Just very quickly on that though, although we've focused very much today on customer value, I think the context of value is actually evolving as well and becoming a lot broader in exactly the same way that you're saying non-profits have lots of different audience often that they have to deliver different value to. I think companies are increasingly realizing that it's not just about offering value to customers, it's also offering value to the communities that they operate in. And suppliers, and becoming so looking at value from a much more holistic perspective, I think is definitely a big trend that we're seeing at the moment. Yeah,
and particularly suppliers as well. It was an often overlooked part of industry, particularly in the kind of retail sector where I was. The conversation's getting so interesting, but I beg people for questions. So
go back. Let's do questions.
So one of the challenges about focusing on the value to the customer is deciding what not to do, what to deprioritize, what messages to discard. So any examples you might have of how to bring that discipline and rigor to focusing on the right parts? I'm going to ask you that. Well, I think is that all right?
Yes, well, yeah, definitely putting me on the spot a bit there, but I mean, for me in the space that I'm usually operating in, it's cheating a bit because it's quite easy. I basically just usually tell them to eliminate 90% of any messages which are about a feature, and swap them with messages which are about the outcome that whatever you're doing delivers to the customer. So the first step, I think, is to focus much more on the outcome, not the features or the benefits, because outcome is, as I hopefully explained before, is kind of a level beyond simple benefits. What else? I mean, obviously, the degree to which you can monetize them, and if you're a business, and how profitable that value is obviously also a very important factor to consider, because there are things which people will find nice, and would say they would like to have them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to pay more for them. And there are other aspects of whatever your product or service are, which people will be prepared pay more for. So in some markets that might be exclusivity. So if you know that there are only going to be 100 of the new McLaren T50s going to be built, then you know, that means you're going to be prepared to pay the extra million above the 1.5 million that it would have cost you to buy an ordinary McLaren, for example. So yeah, scarcity is a big thing, a big driver from that perspective, I think. I'm sure there are lots more. Those are the three that come off the top of my head.
And I wonder whether, I don't know whether, Marsh, this is your...
Yeah, I'm happy to just ask a bit more, because I was thinking more within the organizations as opposed to the initial strategic, you know, having worked out what you want to do and where you really believe the value is. Then the question is really around the alignment question, because of course everybody in the organization joins with their own little personal version of the mission, don't they? or for the outcome, the objective. You take Apple, so some people want it because they got 1,000 songs in their pocket, but some people just want it for a status symbol. Some people might want it because actually they like the practicality of, you know, something that doesn't break. I don't know. So there'll be, or because, you know, ties up with their other machines. So it's just like, it's making sure that everybody, it's how you make sure that within the organization that alignment is, I suppose back to the word authentic really, and genuinely bought into, as opposed to an instruction, which is you just have to tell people this.
Well, yeah, I mean,
to motivate people and to get their personal buy-in, it's like, then you're also sometimes saying, but we don't need that perspective. We want you to persuade you to talk about this bit of the value to the customer.
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say about that is that you can't motivate people, because motivation is mainly intrinsic. So essentially it's all about making whatever you want them to do in their self-interest. And that's true, particularly internally. And what I don't think is that you need to be, and then maybe I gave the wrong impression. What I don't believe is that there should be a kind of although you start at the top, it shouldn't be some kind of dictatorial mandate that you know, that comes down from on high, because that won't work. It might work for a short time, but it won't stick. And that's usually the cause of when I go and ask people to ask 5 or 10 different people about what they think the value is. The cause is that they've been told what it should be, and told you're not allowed to deviate from this at all ever. And then, as you say, people start trying to tweak it themselves. And so I think that the point is to come up with as simple and compact a core as you possibly can. And then in terms of external communication, you're always going to be segmenting your audience anyway and tweaking the message depending on, you know, whether it's a country or whether it's a particular subsection of the market that you're serving. And internally, as I said, it's about obviously they need to be on board with the mission of the company, hopefully, and interested in what the company is doing. That's obviously a very key factor. And if they're customer facing, then you say, listen, these are the messages that we want you to deliver. How you deliver them and which ones you emphasize is up to you. You know, you're an intelligent person, you can see what the situation is. So you have to leave them, build a core, but then leave a bit of freedom for people to express themselves, and tune it to the situation. But at the same time, you must instill the discipline that they can't completely disregard, you know, the core value that we're trying to deliver.
What's the best way, Hamish, for people to follow up with you? If people have got outstanding questions, or if they want to find out a little bit more, what's the best way for them to kind of connect with you after this?
The easiest and most immediate is probably just LinkedIn. So there's not many Hamish Mackenzies on LinkedIn, I think. So certainly not many in Munich. So it should be fairly easy. You can just also visit my website at hamishmackenzie.com. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to give you it's just a very short, very snackable ebook, which kind of gives people some ideas about how to ways of thinking or paths to discovering unique value. And so just kind of some thinking modes. So I'll give that to you, Martyn, and please feel free to share that with your audience. And yeah, as I said, I'm more than happy to jump on a call with anybody who's attended today. No selling, no nothing. I'll just chat with you, whatever your particular interest is. If you want to just talk about this in relation to your particular situation, your organization, more than happy to spend 30 or 40 minutes on the phone or Zoom with anyone here.
Thank you, Hamish. That was fantastic. And I'm sure we'll have another conversation about another excellent topic at some point in the future. Thank you so much all for joining me, and I will hopefully see you again next time. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Martyn. Thanks, everybody.